So very, very warm welcome to all of you. It is really interesting and fun to see where you all are. I'm sitting here in London, and actually it's extremely warm here. We had the warmest day yesterday, and I think it's going to be hot again today. So very unusual for this time of year to be so warm. I see that several of you are from Ghana, from Nigeria, from Bahrain. I believe some from Saudi Arabia. I don't know. When I click on your names, it shows me a map, and therefore it's testing my geography. So anyway, welcome to this webinar this morning. I wonder whether I've met any of you before. Looking at the names that are coming up on the attendee list, I'm not aware of any of you having been on one of my courses before. But if you have, I'm really pleased that you're here again. And if you haven't, then it's great to have the opportunity to spend some time together. My name's Lydia Hurst. I'm a specialist in strategy and planning and leadership development. I've been working with Aztec for many, many years. And like everybody, we are having to learn about this new online world as a way of delivering training to our delegates and maintaining the social distance and avoiding the travel that we now all have to do. So it's a learning experience for me. I have done one or two webinars before, but still, I hope that I will manage the technology today. So we are going to be talking about strategy in the time of this pandemic. Strategy, I find, is a very fascinating topic. It's the management science that requires us to think about the future and to forecast that future, and then to make our plans according to that. And now, on top of all the other variables and uncertainties, we are also having to face the impact of a pandemic, such as certainly none of us in our lifetimes have ever had to face before. So it is truly a very difficult time. And the question is, how do we adapt our strategy in order to deal with that pandemic? So this morning, that's the topic that we're going to be talking about. And I thought very long and hard about how to address this. So what I'm going to do to begin with is to talk more about strategic planning, what it is, what is strategy, how is strategy different from planning and tactics, and then how do we link what we have done before in terms of strategy in order to prepare for disasters, things that we could not predict or did not wish to see either way. And then how do we adapt our strategies and our plans in order to enable us to recover? So strategy is a combination, isn't it? It's a mixture of analysis, it's then a lot of choices, and then very importantly, it's also about implementation. So preparing is possibly part of your analysis, certainly part of your choices, and then disaster recovery is very much a part of your implementation plan. So that's why I've divided the session into those three areas. It's only a 1-hour webinar, and I will come back at the end of the session to talk to you some more about, how we could take this further. If you're interested in these subjects, we could do more detail, more in-depth work. So this is really an overview today. So in order to get to know you a little bit better, I would like you to do a little interactive exercise. So actually, I'm going to try this. It's a first for me, so let's see if it works. What I've done here on this slide is to draw a line or a curve, really, saying that some of you, I'm guessing, might be new to strategy. You've never undertaken any strategic planning, you are not part of a strategic planning function, and so on. So the topic is new to you. Others of you might have a great deal of experience. You've been working in this field for a long time. You may be a very senior manager who is part of the strategy decision-making process for your organization. And then I'm guessing that a number of you will fall somewhere on this line. So whilst I get the whiteboard up, what I would like you to do is in the chat, put a percentage. So those of you who have had no experience of strategy, please put a 0 or something close to 0, maybe 10. Those of you who have a lot of experience might want to say 100, 90, 80, something like that. And those of you with some knowledge, some experience, somewhere in the middle. So there's a 0 coming up there. Don't be too quick for me because I've got to now do this. Let me quickly go to my whiteboard. If I pick this and I pick draw, I will draw my line. And now what I will do is I will draw a text. So we have somebody who's telling me that they are 0. So we'll put an X in the 0. Whoops. Let's have a look. 10, 60. So let's have an X here. And a 60 might be somewhere like here. A 30 might be somewhere like here. Another 10 here. Let's just go for another one here. 40 here. Let's have a quick look. Have I got your full 10, 10? Oh, several 10s. There's a 30 I've missed here. $50 here. 50, 40, 40, 50. Cluster here. Cluster here. Cluster. Another 10 down here. Wonderful. So I don't know if that's all of you, but one of the things that this does is to show us how we can use these tools to interact, for me to get to know you a little bit better. So it's not just me talking to you, but actually trying to address some of your issues. So that's very interesting. So really what we're saying is that we've got nobody at the top here. We've got 1 or 2 of you somewhere in the middle here. So apparently either whether it's within your own function or whether you're actually part of the planning function in your organization, you've got some knowledge and experience, and then quite a few of you much less. So 1 or 2 of you right down at the 0, 10%, that sort of thing. So thank you so much for giving us that insight into where you're coming from. That's really helpful for me. I hope it's also interesting for you. Let me go back to my presentation. So where does that leave us? Let me tell you a little bit about what is strategy, or at least what I believe to be strategy. It's another one of those words that means different things to different people. So I'm obviously going to be giving you my view. And it's always helpful to go right back to the beginning of where did strategy come from. And I would like to draw your attention to this Chinese general in the 6th century BC, a general called Sun Tzu. He was working, or he was serving under King Helu of Wu. I have to say my Chinese history is not great. But what I understand is that he was a very intelligent person, and he recognized the importance of planning, of using public administration. Even in 6th century BC, there was public administration, and the need to employ diplomacy and to build relationships with other nations. And he wanted to do that in order to avoid battle. Battle is very expensive in terms of people, in terms of lives, in terms of money, in terms of equipment, and so on. And I think what he recognized was that if you invested and you built up these relationships, you were able to formulate strategies which avoided battle. So clearly strategy comes from the military. And the first question that a general must ask is whether a battle needs to be fought. And once a decision has been taken, then you can make a plan of action which leads to that goal. And the tactics are then about how to fight the battle, not whether to fight the battle. So How does this relate to the business world, you might ask? So if I take you on another little history lesson, but much closer to home, you'll be aware probably that the Industrial Revolution began in this country, in the UK, in the 19th century and was built mainly around textiles, cotton, wool, those sorts of things. And from that, uh, going into the beginning of the 20th century, was the beginning of some bigger industrial corporations. Now, people like Henry Ford, who I think in the 1920s had the idea that one could mass produce cars, and he created the first Model T Ford. And his idea was that instead of having very expensive, very unique cars, which were being built, but only for the very wealthy, you could mass produce a car and make it much cheaper and much more readily available. And thus was the beginnings of industrialization. Then came the wars in Europe and then globally. And what happened after the war was that a lot of European countries and indeed other parts of the world, Japan, were destroyed. And soon after the war, the country which was least affected was the United States. So it's not surprising that the rise of corporations took place there in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. And people started to study these organizations and how best to run them. And Alfred Chandler was the first one in 1962 to conduct some research around strategy and structure. And this became the beginning of management in the big corporation. It wasn't until the 80s and 90s that Japan, Germany, other European countries, and slowly other parts of Asia, and then later on Africa, also began to get involved in these big corporations. So the third industrial revolution is talked about as beginning in roughly the 1950s when computers became available. They were nothing like what we have today, of course. They were huge, great things, taking up large warehouses and requiring very clean environments and so on. And then we have a much more recent fourth industrial revolution, which was a name that was coined by a gentleman called Schwab at the World Economic Forum. And what he says is that this new era, this new industrial revolution, combines hardware, software, and biology, and represents advances in communication and connectivity. And I think that's really, really relevant to the situation that we're finding ourselves in today, isn't it? This pandemic spread so quickly because we're so connected in this world today. So how do we describe strategy? There are strategy levels in organizations. The way in which we've talked about Sun Tzu and then Chandler and the concepts around strategy have referred mainly to corporate strategy. That's the strategy that affects the whole of the business. And the question that one needs to think about and to ask is, what business should I be in? So my own background is from the oil industry and the petrochemicals industry. So I usually use that as an example. Many different oil companies exist, but they don't all do the same thing, do they? Some are more upstream, some are more midstream, some are more downstream, some go as far as petrochemicals as being part of it. So the question that senior managers need to ask themselves is, what business should I be in? And this is the answer to that question would be in your corporate strategy. You choose what products, what services, what regions, and so on. Breaking that down to the next level are the business unit strategies. So in a big corporation, the chances are that there will be a variety of different products and services. And this then is usually broken down into business units. And the question that a business unit needs to ask is, how can we beat the competition? Why would anyone want to buy our products and services rather than somebody else's? So how can we be different? How can we be better? And how will we therefore acquire the customers that we want in order to deliver the objectives for our organization? The next level of strategy breaks down into departments, teams, projects, and smaller units, organizational units. And these then are faced with the questions, what are our objectives? How do we ensure that our objectives fit with the business unit? How does the business unit fit with the corporate? And not only do they have to think about that, but they also have to think about how it fits with other departments. Again, going back to my origins within petrochemicals, I was on the marketing side, sales side. Our objectives were to find more customers, to sell more product. This is usual for most sales and marketing functions. What did this do to the marketing, to the production, to the manufacturing people? Well, what were their objectives? To minimize cost, to have long runs of product, to have as little waste as possible, not to keep changing from one grade of product to another grade because that creates more waste. So as you can see, there were immediately some conflicts, some challenges between the different departments. And this is true again in most businesses, that some parts of the business have one set of objectives which are at odds with those of another. And that's very healthy. And one of the things at this lower level, at the team project department level, is to iron out those differences of opinion and to reach compromises. And the way in which that needs to happen is to have the interests of the business at heart. So to understand what the overall corporate objectives are. And the final level of the strategy level goes right down to individuals, individual actions, individual behaviors. And this is then answering questions about what's my role? How can I contribute? So each and every person within the organization needs to understand how they contribute. On the radio this morning, on the news, there was a really lovely example of that. And they were interviewing an immigrant from Syria, as it happens, working as a cleaner in one of the hospitals. And he was saying, we are just as important now as doctors, nurses, and other health professionals. Because if we don't keep the hospital clean, then the infection cannot be under control. So I thought that was a wonderful example of saying that every single individual within a company, never mind whether they are the most senior or the most junior, should have a very clear role and a very clear understanding of how they can contribute to the overall objectives. There are lots of different definitions of strategy, and I very much like this one from Johnson and Scholes. These are two British academics from the world of business and strategy, and this is their definition of strategy. It is the direction and scope of an organization over the long term, which achieves advantage for the organization through its configuration of resources within a challenging environment to meet the needs of markets, customers, and to fulfill stakeholder expectations. So I guess when we looked at that breakdown of levels, we were mainly talking about direction and scope. So direction is about where is the organization going, what are its objectives. Scope is what's our business in. So in the oil example, just exploration and refining, exploration, refining and petrochemicals, and so on. That's scope. So what's in and what's out. Then the question is, what's the time period that you're thinking about? And again, if I stick to the oil example, then oil companies have to think very long term, don't they? Their strategies are usually 25 years, 30 years into the future. Why is that? They have to overcome regulatory issues. They have to get permission for development. It takes a very long time to carry out exploration, and so on and so forth. Once something has been agreed, the implementation, like building a new refinery, takes a very long time, securing the finance, making the plans, building, and so on. So everything that they get involved in takes a very long time. And then to recoup the investment is also long term. You're going to have to run that refinery for a long period of time in order to get the investment and more back. So these types of businesses have to think very far into the future. If I show you one of these, it's a bit different, isn't it? Yeah. These guys, what's their time horizon? And if I had you in the room, as I've had many, many delegates over the years, people would say to me a year, 18 months, 2 years, that kind of thing. Yeah. So the time horizon in the technology world is very, very, very different. And each one of your businesses will have its own time horizon. But when we're thinking about strategy, we're thinking about the longest possible, so the furthest away from today. And when we're thinking later on about plans, we break those down into milestones and we think about more short-term, medium-term, and longer-term plans. All of this, why are we doing it? Well, we want to achieve advantage for the organization. And we do that by configuring the resources that we have. And those are our people, the finance, the equipment, the know-how, the intellectual property, and so on and so forth. So what we need to do is to make the best use of those resources in order to achieve that advantage that we're looking for. That's the internal side, but we're doing all of that whilst being aware of a very challenging environment, no more so than now. Even pre-pandemic times, what did we need to think about? We needed to think about our competitors. We needed to think about the global economic situation. We needed to think about the situation in our own region or our own country, about the government and what their agenda is, and so on and so forth. So when we're formulating our strategy, we also have to be aware of those external factors. Now, in the current environment, we need to add to that what's going to happen and how will this affect our business? And I'm going to come back to that. I'm not going to spend time on it now. So what we've done is to introduce a major new variable, which probably overrides a lot of the variables that we were already having to deal with. And we need to think about that very, very carefully and and adjust the strategies that we had to take into account this new situation. We need to also think about our markets and our customers. We need to think about what they need from us today and what they will need from us tomorrow and the next day. So we need to be thinking about our research, our development, our production, our logistics, and all of these issues in order to fulfill their needs. And in addition to our customers, who are, of course, one of our key stakeholders, we may well have other key stakeholders that we also have to be aware of and possibly meet their requirements. So our strategy also will have to deal with not only what we want to do, but what our stakeholders' expectations are. So again, if we had longer, we might do a stakeholder analysis to think about who are your key stakeholders, what is your relationship with them, and how will you manage that expectation? What do you need to do to manage those expectations? Let me just pause for a second to say that if you've got questions as I'm going through these slides, I would very much welcome you to put them into the chat. And then what we will do is if you put a question mark at the end of a question, then I'll be able to pick it up at the end in a question and answer session. So please, if things occur to you whilst I'm talking and you would like to ask me something, please put it in the chat. So strategy has to deal with what's the most important thing. Should we be doing the right things or should we be doing things right? If you, at the turn of the 20th century, were in the production of maybe the wheels for a horse and cart, and you were the best manufacturer of those wheels, and you kept coming up with some new and clever way of producing them, some better materials, and so on and so forth, would you have stayed in business once Henry Ford came up with his Model T? And would the Model T have stayed in business, however good the production line was, when people started producing cars of different colors, different engine sizes, and so on and so forth? So doing things right is important, but doing the right thing, recognizing change, recognizing your customers' needs, recognizing the world around you is even more important. Otherwise, we end up doing things right and possibly going out of business. If I ask you to put some ideas in the box there in the chat, which businesses got it wrong? Can you think of any businesses that got it wrong? Like these cameras, yeah, we no longer need, film cameras, do we? Because we're all using phone cameras. So who went out of business here? Kodak, didn't they? Yeah, for whatever reason, they weren't able to move with the times. At one time, they were ubiquitous. Everybody had a Kodak. Everybody used Kodak film. Everyone had a camera. And then they went out of business. Another example, Nokia. We all had Nokia mobile phones. And now they've had to go into a different line of business because other phone companies have taken over. Yeah. So it's really, really important to think about doing the right things, not just doing things right. Any ideas out there? Encourage any of you to come up with any ideas. So you didn't answer that question, but now I am going to ask you a direct question. So I hope that you are still there and engaging with me. Do you think the corona pandemic was predictable? And was it predictable? And had it been predicted? Let's see what you have to say. No. So most of you, hang on, let's have a look. So let me just read out because I'm not sure if everyone can see. So the majority of you are saying no. I had one yes further back. Sunny, you said yes. Everybody else so far has said no. And then I've got a couple of comments here. Let's have a quick look. Predictable based on past pandemic experience of previous centuries. Yes, like the 1918 flu, the plague and other things. Yep. Some medical experts suspected the case like the one we have. No. Predictable, yes. So I've got 2 yeses. Okay, if people had followed history every 100 years as a pandemic, predicted yes. I think it was predictable as USA Army had a practice session for a pandemic situation. However, they failed it and overlooked the importance of it without applying the feedback. You know, they weren't the only ones. Okay, so thank you very much for your contributions. Yeah, let's see, because this is important. So what do these 3 individuals have in common? I wonder if any of you recognize them. I'm guessing that some of you might well recognize this gentleman in the middle. Yeah, Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft, also founder of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What did Bill Gates say? Back in 2015, he gave a TED Talk. I don't know if you guys are familiar with TED Talks, but they are on all kinds of interesting and relevant subjects. So back in 2015, Bill Gates predicted that pandemics will happen every 20 years or so, not just every 100 years, but every 20 years or so. And that a pandemic with a highly contagious virus would occur. So that was Bill Gates. Nassim Taleb, and I'm going to talk more about him in a minute, he wrote a book back in 2007 that contained reference to a potential virus outbreak. So these 2 are nothing to do with health professionals. Michael Osterholm, who's the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, according to CNN, he wrote in a Foreign Affairs magazine in 2005, "This is a critical point in our history. Time is running out to prepare for the next pandemic. We must act now with decisiveness and purpose." And then there have been others. There have been others who have predicted it. The World Health Organization, the US National Security Council, the former director of USAID, the Office of US Foreign Disaster Assistance under the Obama administration. And actually, under the Obama administration, he actually set up a unit to deal with potential pandemics. And they all said that there's a potential for a virus epidemic similar to the 1918 flu pandemic. So it was known, it was predicted, yeah? But what happened? That's the question. What happened to these predictions? Let me bring you back again to what happens in organizations, what happens in the business world. I'm sure that most of you will have had experience of risk assessments and risk management, yeah? Why do we do that? Why do we assess risks? Well, we want to know what the potential impact of a risk might be and how likely it is to occur. So the impact, as I've shown here, could be on the environment, it could be financial, it could be reputational. There's all sorts of things that could happen. And what are the chances? How do we assess those risks? Do we have a risk management function? Do we have everybody in the organization tuned in to the possibility of risks? And if they are, how do they communicate and share those risks? The result of a risk assessment is usually some kind of a grid, isn't it? A traffic light grid from green to red. So green says low impact, most unlikely, very low risk. Red says very high impact, very likely, we must do something about it. How will we mitigate this risk? If we had, as a management team, said there is a possibility of a pandemic, how would it have featured in most companies' risk assessments? What do you think? People would have thought that the likelihood was low, the impact was high. I'm guessing that, yeah? It's something that might happen, and it might happen to them over there, but it's very unlikely to affect my business, in my country, in what I'm doing, yeah? So our risk assessment process itself, which is what we use in order to inform us about what could happen, what bad things could happen. Actually, risk should also look at good things, but that's another subject, yeah? What might happen? And at the highest level for an organization, the risk is, are we going to be in business tomorrow or not? Have we got a sufficiently resilient and sustainable business that will carry us through if some of these risks actually occur? And this is covered by business continuity issues, by risk management practices, and so on. But it should also be very fundamentally part of our strategy. How do we make our strategy resilient? How do we ensure that when we're forecasting those futures, we've taken into account the things that are really important and could have a really big impact? So what I'm really saying is that there were people out there saying, we need to think about this pandemic business. It might happen. And then there are risk functions in businesses that haven't even considered it. Probably. So why does that happen? I'm going to carry on and explain some of that. So I mentioned before the gentleman by the name of Nassim Taleb, who wrote that book called The Black Swan. And what the story goes that there was a British explorer that went to Australia sometime in the 19th century. When he left Britain, there were lots of swans swimming around in all the parks, just as they are today. Yeah, ducks, swans, and all the rest of it. And people had only ever seen white swans. So it never occurred to them that there could be anything other than a white swan. And this gentleman went to Australia, and lo, what did he find? He encountered the first ever black swan that a European had seen. So he encountered something that no one had even imagined or predicted. So nowadays, he's written this book and he's talked about, I think he talked mainly about finance and the financial crash and the economic cycle and these sorts of issues, but it applies to any kind of black swan event. So a black swan event, let me just give you here we go. Yes, here we go. A black swan event is shorthand for an unexpected, low probability, high impact event. So people these days often talk about black swans when it's something that is hard to predict, hard to imagine. So when we're doing risk assessments, it's really, really tough, isn't it? How on earth do we think of what those black swan events could be? And if we think of them, how on earth do we try and judge what their impact might be on our business? What happened to New Orleans? I'm going to share a story with you again. So I have a favorite journalist in the Financial Times, a gentleman by the name of Tim Harford, and he recently wrote an article, and I'm going to quote from his article. So April the 16th, he was talking about these issues, about why is it so hard to predict. So if you think about New Orleans, and the city was protected by what are called levees, which are like dikes, like in the Netherlands or probably other low-lying countries. Yeah, you build up dikes in order to protect you from surges of waves and sea during very big storms. And New Orleans had these levees, but it was also predicted that they wouldn't hold if there was a very severe hurricane. And given that climate change is occurring, the strength of hurricanes has grown tremendously. And what they forecast is that they would break and that the city would end up 20 feet underwater, with all the consequent disaster for people's lives and livelihoods. Newspapers such as the Houston Chronicle and the New Agency said back in 2001 that one of the biggest potential catastrophes to hit the US would be a major hurricane hitting New Orleans. So this was predicted back in 2001. Now think of September 2004. Yeah, all these predictions were suddenly becoming very real. A 140-mile-per-hour hurricane was heading straight for the city. The inhabitants were encouraged to evacuate. The mayor couldn't make it mandatory because he knew that about 100,000 of the population didn't have a car and therefore wouldn't be able to leave. And also because so many people were in their cars trying to leave the city, the roads were jammed and it was very hard for people to leave. So what happened? The roads were jammed, airports were closed, conference delegates were stranded. There were no emergency shelters. Nothing had been prepared. And the mayor thought about using the Superdrome, but he knew it wasn't hurricane proof and he hadn't equipped it as a shelter. So here we are in September 2004 with this enormously powerful hurricane barreling towards the city. What happened? They had luck. They had luck, and the hurricane diverted at the last minute and it did not hit New Orleans. So, lessons learned from this experience? What would you imagine having had that? No lessons learned. Nothing happened. 11 months later, Katrina hit and the city was drowned. The Superdrome was used as a shelter and it couldn't cope. Citizens either couldn't or wouldn't leave. The levees breached in over 50 places. So, I've got two examples that I want to share with you about the response to that terrible event. Who were the heroes? Who do you think said this? This company will respond to the level of this disaster. A lot of you are going to have to make decisions above your level. Make the best decision you can with the information that's available to you at the time, and above all, do the right thing. Do you think that was the federal government saying that? Can anyone guess? Can anyone guess? Put it in the chat if you can guess who said that. No guesses. It was the CEO of Walmart, Lee Scott. So what happened was that the Walmart managers of the different stores in and around New Orleans contacted their CEO. They had a conference call. They described the situation to their CEO, and he said, do what you have to do. So they did. They opened the stores as shelters. What's inside a Walmart? Food, water, provisions, shelter. And they were the first on the scene to help. They were the first on the scene to help. What do you think that FEMA, the federal agency, said? So let me read to you what one of their operatives said. Sir, I know that the situation is past critical. Here, some things you might not know. Hotels are kicking people out. Thousands are gathering in the streets with no food, no water. Dying patients in the medevac tent. Estimates are that many will die within hours. What do you think that the director of FEMA said in response? Thanks for the update. Anything specific I need to do or tweak? He simply was overwhelmed. He had absolutely no idea what to do. So, why do we fail to prepare for disasters? Why do we bury our heads in the ground? Why do we act like an ostrich, hiding our heads? Because of many different reasons. And again, Tim Harford goes on to give lots of descriptions based on psychological tests, examples, research that's been carried out, and so forth. Yeah. It's hard to imagine the unimaginable. We all suffer from psychological cues. So there's something called negative panic. So some psychologists did an experiment. They put some people in a room and asked them to fill in questionnaires. While they were in the room, they filled the room with smoke. When there was only one person in the room filling in the questionnaire, when they noticed the smoke, they paid attention and they went out and they went to look for help to see if there was a fire or something bad was going on. When there were 3 or 4 people in the room, they all looked at each other and nobody moved. They took cues from one another, social cues from one another. And when one person didn't move, they thought, well, it can't be serious. So nobody did anything. And I'm sure that in your own experience in life, you will have had that sort of experience. You know, it's a bit like this guy in FEMA. What am I going to do about it? I don't know what to do about it. Panic. Yeah. This happened now with the pandemic, didn't it? In January, we started getting news from China. In February, the news got worse and the pandemic spread to Europe and in Italy. And it was only when people saw that it could actually hit them that they panicked. And then everybody panicked. And the result was a world shortage of toilet paper. Yeah. So we all do this and we need to be aware of it. Yeah. The Ostrich Paradox, or egotistical optimism. Something won't happen to me. I can give you an example from Hurricane Sandy on the east coast of the US. Yeah, this was a hurricane that was barreling up the east coast. They knew it was coming. The meteorologists were giving people lots of information, and people stayed at home. They didn't move. They didn't go anywhere. They didn't evacuate. Why? Because it wasn't going to happen to them. And then the last one in the case of the pandemic is what he calls exponential myopia. It's very hard to imagine how fast this pandemic was going to spread. The exponential nature of it, the fact that one person got infected would then infect 2 or 3 other people. And therefore you go from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 to thousands within days and weeks. And I think that our Prime Minister here in the UK really suffered from that, at the point where he was saying that he just wanted to, hang on, I'm really sorry about the outside noise. I'm going to go and close my window. Apologies. Sorry about that. This is the problem of delivering from home offices. So exponential myopia, at the time that Boris Johnson was saying, I'm still shaking everybody's hand and it's okay, he hadn't realized, he had not understood what this was all about. Okay, so we need our leaders to understand these things and we need our leaders to respond appropriately, don't we? And there is a grave danger, as I've shown you, with Hurricane Katrina, with the pandemic, with many issues, of senior management just being overwhelmed and therefore not being able to deal with the situation as is required. I've got another example for you from the NHS here in the UK, where they also did pandemic planning. So coming back to my original agenda, we've talked about what is strategy, and we've recognized that in order to prepare for potential disasters, this needs to be part of our strategic planning. We need to recognize, as part of our risk management, as part of our business resilience, that things might happen, and we then need to be prepared. And then, and only then, can we actually recover from them. So, another further examples of people of unpreparedness. This comes from a Harvard Business Review article, also back in the early 2000s, written by two professors, Bazerman and Watkins. And what their article is called, "The Disasters You Should Have Seen Coming." So they recognize that people should see these things. People know about them, they should recognize them. So the first thing in order to be prepared is to recognize what might happen. COVID was actually a white swan. It wasn't a black swan. It had been predicted, hadn't it? A number of different people and in a number of different situations had predicted that that a pandemic could occur. So it should have been recognized, yeah, and therefore steps taken. So how do we prioritize? What do we need to do if we're going to prioritize? If you're going to recognize and mitigate risks, there is a cost attached to it. So the NHS, I think in 2016, carried out, a bit like one of you said in the chat earlier on with the American government, American Army, they carried out a pandemic preparation exercise. And what they did was to assume that a variant of the normal flu would occur, and what would they do about it? And they recognized that they needed sufficient hospital beds, personal protective equipment like the masks and the gowns and the gloves and all these things. And all of these things were recognized and understood. And once again, a bit like with the Katrina situation, action was not taken. Action was not taken. And the stockpiles, because people didn't really believe it, I think that's the major issue. It's a mixture of heart and mind. So the logic says this could happen, and the heart says it won't happen to me. So if we're going to prioritize, what do we need to do? We need to build up those stocks of PPE. We need to have a plan in action for how to deal with it when it happens. We need to have people who know what to do. We have to recognize that an infectious disease has to be dealt with in a very different way from what we're normally dealing with in most hospitals, and so on and so forth. So we need a mobilization plan, and we need people who have the right skills and training to be able to act quickly. So I now want to, before we finish for today, give you a wonderful example. And this also came from a newspaper article just in the last 10 days or so, where a hospital in Edinburgh in Scotland had a pandemic preparation plan, a disaster recovery plan, and they were able to implement it within 24 hours. So let me describe to you what they did. So by the way, the hospital is called the Western General. When they heard the stories coming from Wuhan, they didn't wait for the pandemic to reach Italy and other cities. They started acting straight away within 24 hours. What did they do? They repurposed a building for emergency treatment. They set up a community testing unit. They initiated a contact tracing protocol. They made the use of full personal protective equipment mandatory for all staff. They expanded their intensive care facility, and eventually they trebled it in size. They had the full buy-in of their management. They introduced these approaches for all their teams and all their staff, and they did all of that within 24 hours. So how did they do that? Because they knew what they were doing. They had a plan. They almost certainly practiced beforehand. And when they practiced, they then didn't disregard what they'd learned. They actually acted on their practice. It was the first time ever that this hospital had had to do this. Anyone who arrived from China with a cough or a fever was tested. They moved their vulnerable patients out to people's homes in order to liberate space on their wards. They set up this drive-through testing in the grounds of the hospital, and it was the first testing unit in the country. Many people who were tested were quarantined in this new separate building for infectious diseases while they waited for results. So they kept them in isolation. The wards were emptied. Medics and staff were retrained for critical care and infectious diseases. And the result of all of this were excellent. None of their clinical staff contracted the disease. And they were able to treat 40 patients in their intensive care unit. Now, I don't know how big their intensive care unit. I don't think it's one of the biggest hospitals. I imagine it's one of the medium-sized hospitals, a general hospital, not even a teaching hospital. So what happened here? Yeah. And now they're preparing for a possible second wave because their processes worked and they feel prepared for it. I thought it was a very impressive example of prioritization, preparation, planning, and then mobilization, and having a very clear remit of management support and plans, and everybody having a very clear role and knowing what to do. So obviously it's on a very small scale, it's just one hospital, but for me what it begs the question is, why didn't every hospital have one of these plans in place? Yeah, the NHS is a funny creature because although it's national, it's also very local. So there are national requirements and then there's local action. And actually, I think that applies to so many businesses as well. There is centralized head office, policies, processes, procedures, and so on. And then there's local action. And it's a bit like what happened with Walmart. They were given the go-ahead to act local, to think big and to act local. So I think there are some lessons to be drawn here, which we can do in our own world, in our own businesses. So I'd like to just finish with this, which is to say that actually that it costs money. Unfortunately, it's an investment, isn't it? So you have a conflict, a challenge between efficiency and preparedness. You have the health service back only in January of this year saying, we have to cut costs, we have to maximize use of our hospital beds, we can't have spare capacity in our clinical staff, we must reduce the stocks of our PPE because it's expensive, no coffee for the doctors in meetings because we're saving money, and so on. And possibly, I don't know really, was there a lack of investment in vaccines? I'm not sure. As against preparedness, having plans, having resources, having know-how. And importantly, one of the things that is being talked about quite a lot now in this world of pandemics is having some slack in the system, having a buffer. So whether that's having extra stock, having working capital tied up, having spare capacity in your hospital, so having some spare beds so that you can cope if there is a sudden rise in demand, having enough doctors and nurses so that they're not worked to the bone, but they have some spare capacity also, and so on and so forth. So this, I'm taking this as an example from the health service, but we can take these issues into the business world as well. So I'm going to ask you, let's see, and this is, I'm going to do a little test now. Going back to that. Right. I'm going to do a little test and I'm going to show you a Padlet board. And this is the sort of tool that we can use when we do longer online training. So let me give it a go, see if it works. Can everyone see this? How do I find that out? Let me just see. How do I know? I'd like to know whether everybody can see this. Yes, fantastic. Wonderful, it works. So what I would like you to do, this is called a Padlet board. And it's a way of just sharing your thoughts about what I've just been saying, okay? What are my strategic challenges? What are my organization's priorities? That's the topic. I've written it up here. And what you can do is you pick up this little pen here, this plus in the bottom right-hand corner. You click on that, and then you get one of these Post-it notes effectively, okay? It's got my name, it'll have your name, and you can put in there your ideas. So I'm going to take this one away. I started it off by saying, what are my thoughts? Which is the hardest? recognizing potential hazards, deciding on priorities, or mobilizing the workforce. So what I'd like each of you to do is click on that plus sign. Oh, hang on. Have I given you that plus sign? No, I haven't. Bear with me. I'll give it to you right now. My fault. I'll give it to you right now. Let me go back in here. So in the chat, I'm going to give you the link. You've got the link. So if you now click on the link, all of us will be able to see. Does it work? It's a great way of doing a quick brainstorm this and of sharing your thoughts about what we've just been describing. Can you, oops. Okay. Can you access this? Aha, great. Why can't I see them? Ah, here they are. Okay, hang on, let's bring them up. Right, so we've got quite a few of you adding to this. Lovely. Might be another one down there. Aha. Can everyone now see what our thoughts are here? Oh, there's more coming. I want to do that. I wonder. Or maybe because he's still doing it. So, thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions. Let's have a very quick look. Mobilizing the workforce to buy into the strategy. Unless we recognize the issue, we can't prioritize. Absolutely. Absolutely. Hazards, mobilizing, recognizing, deciding on priorities. Yeah. Getting everyone concerned involved for easy mobilization. Absolutely. RPM, indeed. So I think we have to finish for today. I'm sorry about that. In a way, we've only just got started. Let me finish the sharing and go back to the presentation. Wonderful. Oh, I'm sorry, there was one more Padlet there, but I'm going to have to call it a day on that. Thank you so much for contributing to that. And I hope it's given you some food for thought. Now, the issue around strategy is how much of our time, money, investment, planning is going to be spent on recognizing what's going on thinking about how we're going to deal with it, on preparing plans. Think about that Edinburgh hospital, how well organized they were, how the management commitment was there, and therefore how everything else flowed from it. Yeah. And that's strategic. That is their strategy. So really, really key, isn't it? Yeah. So just to finish off, thank you very much for attending. I really hope you've enjoyed it. To meet the social distancing requirements, we're developing online courses all the time. If you want to learn more about strategy or business continuity, take a look at our website. There are courses coming up on there. Get in touch with us. We want to help. If there are specific topics, okay, what is Padlet? Okay, I'll explain it. So Padlet is just a tool. What I used was just a tool, and it's a way of getting you to interact with me, so we could use it for lots of different things. Okay. It was a way of me getting you to think about how are you going to act on what I've just been describing to you. Yeah. So it's just a tool, and there are lots of these tools. To be honest, I'm just learning about them too, because obviously, I was teaching in the classroom before that. So I'm really looking forward to doing more of this. As I say, we're developing longer courses, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you all again. Thanks for coming, and thanks for your feedback. There we go. We didn't need to do question mode. Good. Naziru, what is your question? Can you write it again? Where was the question? I wonder if I can. Okay. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, that was the Padlet one. Okay, I haven't got the question. I think we're going to have to call it a day. Please send your questions through to the office and they will contact me, and I can come back to you separately. How can I make that bigger? Yes, let me do that. Yeah. May not have anticipated crisis as management. Now that it has occurred, how can existing strategy be adapted to minimize the impact of pandemic on business and organizations? So that's a big question, and I'm afraid that we've run out of time. It is a very relevant question, and really that's why I gave you that RPM. Yeah, what are you going to do about it? How is this pandemic going to affect your business, and how are you going to change your strategies? That's the issue. And I'm afraid we don't have time to address more of that today. But if you want to come on one of our strategy sessions, which we're just about to launch, then we will have more time and we can address some of these issues. There's no magic answer, of course. Good. Good. Thank you so much, all of you, for your very nice feedback. I'm very grateful for that, because it's new for me too. So Yeah, this is a whole new experience. Yeah, I would much prefer to have you in a room with me, but what can you do? Great. Well, thanks everybody. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now. Bye.